is maybe different for others. It actually occurred in 1967. I was flying missions over North Vietnam in an F-4. And so every day I had a project. I had to plan the project. I had to plan the timing. I had to plan to execute the project successfully. And as I crossed over the border into North Vietnam, it was the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare. We were getting shot at 100% of the time. And so the plan had to be executed to evade risk. It had to be built on risk avoidance. Every second you were over North Vietnamese airspace. And so I adopted an evasive maneuver that was executed crossing the border, and it never ended until I got back over the border. But in the middle, I had to hit the target. Now I noticed many years later, I'll go forward to when I got into software development. I noticed that software projects had similar problems. Every day I would come into work and there would be something that was trying to shoot that project down. And the style of managing those projects was not effective at dealing with the problems. So, in Vietnam, only 50% of the pilots I flew with got shot down. But in the projects, particularly in the big banks where I worked, 83% of the projects would fail, okay? So I realized they needed the same kind of risk avoidance mechanisms that was built into fighter aircraft. So let's say from actually even before 1967 till about 1975, I was in the Air Force flying high-performance jets. The other thing I noticed when I got into the big banks is that not only were projects failing, but the people didn't have a way to understand how to me it was looking like they were trying to land a project on an aircraft carrier. You know, the land was kind of moving on them as they're trying to land that project, and they didn't have the tooling to understand where they were. If you think about how a high-performance jet has to land on an airplane, there's many different things you need to know. You need to know your airspeed. You need to know how far away the runway is. You need to know your rate of descent. You need to know the angle of attack of the aircraft, because depending on how pitched up that nose is, you can get into a place where it takes more power to go slower. See, I saw that happening on the waterfall projects. It's called Brooks' Law. If you take a big project and it's late, you add more people, it gets later, and then the project crashes. Now fortunately, when you're flying fighters, you produce a big black burning hole in the ground, so it gets people's attention. But for some reason, when the big project fails at the bank, people don't learn from the experience. They still keep those projects crashing all the time. So, well, let me tell you how I got into the bank. I actually went from the Air Force I became a professor of medicine in a medical school. Interesting transition. And from 1975 to 1986, I was funded by the National Cancer Institute to study biological systems, and particularly how does a human cell work and how is it transformed into a malignant state. And my job was to work with some of the people that were my advisors, were the leading scientists on the planet, and our job was to actually establish why cancer occurs, because people didn't even know it at that time. And by 1980, we had established the model, which is now the standard model for thinking about how cancer occurs, and to mathematically model that occurrence in the human cell and translate that model such that it would be predictive of data on all the data in cancer patients that we had in the United States. The first time I ran that model, it took a third of the computer science budget for my department in the university for a year. They told me I could never run that model again. So I had to get creative. And I worked with the head of the medical computing laboratory, a physician who was acquiring new technologies, and we got a fault-tolerant system, a system which was being used in the big banks for automated telesystems, but it had a unique characteristic, two really unique characteristics. It never went down. It was fault-tolerant, but it also had an architecture that enabled me to grab every spare cycle of every CPU, and there were multiple CPUs, without disturbing normal production. So for 5 years, I grabbed every spare cycle on multiple processors to get my PhD. Now, at that time, a banking company that was running 150 banks across North America came by, and they said, okay, you know, at the university you guys have, you know, all the knowledge, but almost no money, but over at the bank, we don't know what we're doing and we have all the money. So why don't you come on over to the bank, you know, and help us out. You know, we'll make you the vice president of advanced systems. You can lead us into the future. And they said, and we'll make you an offer that your wife can't refuse. which they did. She agrees, they did. And so I wind up at the bank, okay? How many of you are bankers in here? Banks? There's a lot of them in Zurich. Okay. So I wind up at the bank, and the first thing I notice is they have hundreds of COBOL programmers. Do you still have COBOL programmers here in Zurich? A few of them still left. And I was looking at what they were doing, and I noticed all their projects were late. Are your projects still late? And when they were late, the management would get upset, and they would put pressure on the developers. And when they put pressure on the developers, it just made it worse. They just got later, and the customers were really unhappy. Now, I had spent 11 years modeling complex systems and was an expert on systems theory. And so I looked at this thing called running software development in a bank as a system. And any system has certain stable states in a state space, and this was one of them. And I noticed that no matter what the management did, they just reinforced this state of late, unhappy people, pressure, unhappy customers. Everything the management did made it worse. And I couldn't believe what they were doing. I said, you know, either these people are crazy or I'm crazy. I need to figure this out. Because I had never worked in software other than with my own team writing my own software. And we had to solve really hard problems, which we never would have solved using this system, which is a complete failed system. Okay? So for the next 10 years, I tried experiments. I went through 4 companies where I was head of engineering, and we tried experiments to try to break out of this stuck pattern. What I was trying to get to is, you know, I thought that projects should always be early. And, we should be kind to the management. You know, they should get all their bonuses. But the developers should be having fun. You know, software development, I went into software development because it was fun. It was interesting. Okay? So that's what it should be. And the customers, they should be ecstatic. They should like your banking software like they like their iPhone. Okay? That's what we want. But how to get there? Because to go from one stable state to another, you have to cross a region that is unstable. There's a lot of chaos out there. So you have to, first of all, inject energy into the system that's broken. And the first level of energy we injected in had to do with what I learned from 15 years of working with entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. How they started up entrepreneurial teams, brought out new companies, took them public, and cashed out. And I worked with many of them who had retired in their 30s, never had to work again in their lives, and they were trying to figure out how to make the world a better place. And they were doing by building high energy teams, just like they did in the software business. So we noticed that most teams, everybody is headed in a little different direction than the other person. You know, some people are headed forwards, some people are headed sideways, some people are headed backwards. And if you can figure out how to align the team, get them all agreed on a central direction, they can immediately double their performance by working less, simply because everybody is headed in the right way. And once you get that going, then people actually feel that what they're doing is constructive. They feel like they're working together. They start feeling good about one another. And then you can start building team spirit into the equation, just like you do in sports teams. And as soon as you start building that team spirit, you can double productivity again. So what I was interested is building teams that could build so much software so fast, the managers and the customers would be saying, you have to slow down. It's too much. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So I knew it was possible. It was just a way to figure out the mechanism. Now, it took until 1993. I was actually hired into a company called Easel Corporation in 1993. Not as a VP of engineering. They were actually recruiting a VP of engineering, but the CEO, a guy named Doug Kahn, had just acquired a software company, actually a German company, a German Smalltalk compiler company. And he had bought that company to take his products to the next level. Easel was, I believe, the first fourth-generation language company in the business, and they were getting increasing competition from companies like PowerSoft, and they needed to ramp the technology to the next level. And they thought object-oriented tooling was the way to go, and so they went up and bought a Smalltalk company. But the question was then, what were the tools? And that was my job. My job was to create a tool set and do it in 6 months that would bring out a new product that would replace all of their legacy products. They didn't know what the new product was. They just knew it had to be twice as good and twice as fast as anything they'd ever done. And Doug said, Jeff, you've launched a lot of new technologies. And we've got 10 guys that can be VP of engineering, but nobody that could take this unknown product and deliver it in record time. And we think that you could do that if you're willing to come in and take a small team of 5 or 6 people and figure it out. So I was hired in kind of like a chief engineer at Toyota. Build this new car and do it really fast. And on the way, figure out what it should be. So off we went. The first thing we did, as I had done with many new technologies, object database technologies, information retrieval on the internet, several different things, the first thing we needed to do was review all the literature in the computer science journals and research papers to know everything that had ever been done so that we could take it beyond. And it always seemed to take about 1,000 carefully studied papers before you got to the end of what was already available. Turned out in this case, we reviewed 30 years of IBM systems journals. And then we started wading through everything. On about the 300th paper, we came across a paper by 2 Japanese guys who were visiting professors at Harvard Business School. And it was unusual because it was published in the Harvard Business Review, not in a computer journal. And in there, Professors Takeuchi and Tanaka talked about going all around the world looking at best teams what did they see that really worked? And they noticed that the teams that really worked really reminded them of sports teams, and rugby in particular. And in particular, the scrum formation in rugby. They worked like they were all linked together, moving the ball forward down the field and working around or overcoming any impediment that got in the way with intensity and focus. And they had seen this in many Japanese manufacturing companies, consumer product companies, a couple of US companies that were not software companies. So we looked at this paper, and they described the style of how management set up such a team, and how they invested in such a team, and how they treated such a team. And we looked at that, and they said, the whole team said, you know, that is exactly what we need for software development. It'll provide us a formal model to produce high-performing teams. And Takeuchi and Tanaka had called that style of project management Scrum. Scrum project management. Now it's interesting because that was in 1993, and I never met Professor Tanaka until this January. I went to Tokyo specifically to meet Professor Tanaka. And in that time, Tanaka has actually become what many people argue is the leading management guru in the planet. He's replaced Peter Drucker, the guy who invented the concept of management. And he is tremendously fascinated that his work, you know, largely in Japanese manufacturing and management theory, has been implemented on a huge scale in software all over the planet. And so we spent a good time together, and then he said, you know, when you go back to Boston, Professor Takeuchi is back at the Harvard Business School. And Professor Takeuchi had been the dean of the Hitsubashi Business School for 20 years in Tokyo, and was forced to retire by hitting the retirement age. And so we went back to Harvard. So we get back there, and the first thing he wants me to do is teach his class at the Harvard Business School, which I did with my wife Arlene last Friday. We got together with the Harvard Business School students. And I find that he's teaching a different style of management to the Harvard students that's a counterpoint. You know, all this strategy and driving companies by the numbers might have some value, except that it's not really how it works. If you go in and look at the best companies, how they started, how they became great, it's all about the people. It's all about inspecting and adapting. It's all about being surprised by success and then taking advantage of it. And he's trying to introduce Scrum into the curriculum in Harvard Business School. And this example he has of large-scale deployment in software is a nice tool for him to add to his arsenal. Okay? So that paper, Scrum, was created directly from that Takeuchi and Tanaka paper, the first Scrum team. And we formed the team. It was based on all the knowledge that I had gotten from working with Bell Labs for many years, also working with people at MIT, particularly the Media Laboratory at MIT. We knew certain things were really important. For example, Bell Labs had removed all titles from development teams. Based on 10 years of research on best teams of the world, they found what was it that made teams perform well. And they discovered that it was the way the individuals communicated with one another and how they interacted. This is the first principle of the Agile Manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. We didn't just make that up. There's 10 years of Bell Labs research that show that is what's most important. Okay? So once they understood that, they came up with a metric to calculate it called communication saturation. Then they went out and did 200 case studies in companies all over the world and got hundreds of data points at every company and did regression analyses to figure out, okay, what is it that cripples communication saturation and brings performance down? And they found the major thing is specialized roles and silos of information. That's what destroys productivity. And so they said at Bell Labs, we're not going to have that. Everybody is going to be a member of the team. So we already had that before we looked at Takeuchi Tanaka, but Takeuchi Tanaka had a formal way of setting up these teams. And when the team looked at that and said, you know, we had a who should be the team leader, and what would we call them? We decided the Scrum Master, because it was going to be Scrum. And we started the first Scrum team, actually started Scrumming in January of 1994. We worked this all up in the fall of 93. The first Scrum team started Scrumming in 1994. About the middle of the first month of Scrumming,